Now we will give the floor to the keynote speech from the perspective from Israel, a critical and disruptive view from Dr. Ofra Graicer, expert in systemic operational design, strategic thinking and leadership, working in the last decades with military and defense establishments around the world to transform them into self-disruptive ones. Dr. Ofra gives lessons in generals at the School of Defense together with BG and Dr. Shimon Navi to guide them through the process of the design of the strategy and the operations for the new age. The research areas of Dr. Graicer go from deep operations up to special operations and cybernetic, developing future concept, war games, and drills. Her book, Two Steps Ahead from Deep Ops to Special Ops, has been in the main schools since 2009, performed as snipers, officials at FDI and political science and safety studies. Her website is www.ofragraicer.com. The floor is yours, Doctor.
Gracias. Juan Mañez, mi presentación. Ahí está. General Puentes, Coronel Rojas.
General Puentes.
Colegas,
Coronel
amigos
Rojas,
todos, gracias por
and
invitarme
friends.
a hablar
Thank
con
you
ustedes
very much for inviting
sobre
me
temas
to be
muy
here
serios por mí,
talking to
profesional y
you
personalmente.
for these important serious
Esta es mi
topics.
segunda vez en
This is
Colombia.
my second time here
Hace
in
3 años
Colombia.
tuve
3
el
years
privilegio
ago, I
de
had the
participar en
privilege
una
to be part
conferencia
of one lecture
especial organizada por
that
mis
was
queridos
especially
amigos,
organized
Coronel
by
Pedro
my dear
Rojas
friends,
y profesor
Colonel
Philippe
Pedro
Dufour,
Rojas and Philippe Dufour from
Philippe
Canada.
no pudo
Philip
acompañarnos hoy,
couldn't
pero
be
su
with
espíritu
us, but his spirit and his knowledge
conmigo en
are
esta
with me
conferencia.
in this
Ojalá pudiera
lecture,
dar
and
en
I hope
español,
that I
pero
could
esto
give
es
it
todo el
in
español que
Spanish.
tengo para
That's all the
ustedes hoy.
Spanish I have for you today.
Okay. I'm starting with, okay, here is me speaking English. I'm starting with my positioning, and I'm going to talk a lot today about, I'm going to mention 2 words, positioning and sensors. And I don't see how we can do anything in the world strategically without them. Whenever we read a book or we see a video or see a movie or we hear a lecture, it's important to know who the person is talking to us, what is their background. It helps us understand and reflect on ourselves when we hear their materials. So, beginning with me. First and foremost, I am Team Israel. Politically, I am Team Israel, and I like my team to win every time. I don't like Israel being the black sheep or the victim. We've done that in the past, so I like us winning. And this is a photo from the last Olympics in Tokyo. Our judo team men and women didn't do so well individually, but it was the first Olympics when there was also a team of men and women together, gender neutral team, and in the general neutral team, we took third place. So, Team Israel. Okay. I think it was mentioned also in my bio. I'm also a soldier. In Israel, we all, at the age of 18 years old, it is a compulsory service. From 18 to 20 for women, from 18 to 21 for men. In my profession, I train snipers. I was a lieutenant. You can see me. Oops, sorry. You can see me over here. Looking at the camera. These are M14s, by the way. They're from the Vietnam War, and we used them until 2000 or something. And one more thing, why is it important for me to mention that I'm a soldier? Because existentially, when soldiers talk about war, it is very, very different than when other people talk about war. I'm also a doctor. Why am I mentioning it? Besides the fact that I really like my subject matter, Winger, the book is in English. I actually talked to mi hermano Pedro that will make translated to Spanish. Beside the fact that this book is about special operations, deep operations, and systemic operational design, it is also a reflection of how to think critically about the world. And when I'm saying critically, I mean to think, if you remember the movie The Matrix, is to remember that we, as critical thinkers, we want to understand a reality that keeps on changing. We have to think in 3 different levels of awareness. The first one is the obvious one. It's the ontology. It's what we see, it's what we hear, it's what we sense, going back to our sensors. It's what we feel, it is tangible, and this is what we usually do. If you think about this spaghetti map of Afghanistan, General Crystal's spaghetti map, it's all about the ontology. And the second level of awareness is the structures of our knowledge. It's the lenses that we look through at the world, and that's how we interpret it. If at some point we thought that the Earth was flat, this is how we interpreted phenomena. Then we understood that it is round, and it is changed our understanding. So the second level of awareness is the structures of knowledge. And the third level of awareness occurs when there are paradigm shifts, which means that we can no longer understand reality through those structures of knowledge, and then we have to change them. And this is hard, and we don't like to do that. So I'm also a doctor, and I exercise critical thinking. And finally, with all due respect to the academy, without friction with reality, we're just theories filled with black holes. So my laboratory for 20 years has been the Israeli Defense Forces General's course. And although I didn't practice generalship myself, I'm a lieutenant, this is all that I saw. We were in the same laboratory together, the instructors and the generals. We followed them also to their jobs later on. So this is where the experience comes from. And they shared with us their insights, understanding, frustrations, and challenges. In this photo, obviously I have an ego as well. In this photo, this is a photo from about 2 months ago. From left to right, this is our J2, Oded Basyuk, who was my student. Next to him is the commander of Northcom Command, Amir Baram, a paratrooper. He was also my student. To his right is the Chief of General Staff, Aviv Kochavi. He was also my student. And on the total right is our new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, who wasn't my student, but he's a colleague and acquaintance, and we used to talk about the geopolitics of Israel before he became a parliament member. So practitioners is also a view that I hold. So you've heard operational design or systemic operational design. In short, we call it SOD. And systemic, let's break it down a little bit. I'm not going to spend too much time around it. You can go to the website of the Archipelago of Design and see many, many written and videos and podcast materials on systemic operational design. Now, when we say Archipelago of Design, it doesn't mean that all of us exercise military design in the same way. I'm only talking about the Israeli view of design, although we were the pioneers of design. And you can actually read it from, it's in Spanish, the Pioneers of Design, an interview I did with Shimon Ave. So you can take a look at it as well. So when we say system thinking, we're not talking about hard systems, we're not talking about engineering systems, we're talking about living systems, which is the ecology and humans together. And this is hard to measure and hard to comprehend, and we need the language of systems to understand it. Fritjof Capra is one of the philosophers we like to use. He's a great guy. Maybe one more thing about systems. When I say systems, I'm talking about complicated things When we say that something is complicated, it is hard to execute. When we talk about complex systems, we're talking about systems that are hard to understand. This is very, very, very different. It's a much greater challenge. It's much more abstract. And this is what we think generals are challenged with, not the type of complicated problems. For that, they have enough people beneath them to do the job. Operational art. Operational art is very, very military, but in essence, it's the embodiment of system thinking to operational conduct. We take after the Soviets, actually the Russians, almost 100 years ago, and then the British acknowledged it, and then the Americans acknowledged it, and then Shimon Aver, who was mentioned, brought it also to the IDF. It is a combination of command theory and operational maneuvers in different contexts, and it keeps changing as well every time reality is changing. And finally, design. Now, we see these days militaries taking design from business schools or from design schools like IDO or MIT or Harvard. Take this language, you hear a lot about empathy and stuff, and then they bring it to the military, and we think it's a problem. For defense purposes, we need to choose words, concepts, terms very carefully, because it's not the same. Again, going back to the soldier view of life, about life and death, and the existential view of design. This is, by the way, a photo from one of my favorite spots in Israel, in Jerusalem, in the Israeli Museum. It's a work by an international artist called James Turrell. He called it Space That Sets. And basically, it's a huge room, shape of a pyramid. You see that the top is cut, the top is open. And you sit low and you look up and you see the sky, but the sky keeps moving. This is very, very Zen. And there are some installations of James Turrell all over the world, maybe in Colombia as well. But when we say design, and this is the most important thing for us, when we bring design to the military and when we bring design to generals, I'm not talking about other places when maybe you do innovation and you use the language of design. I'm talking about this design for generals, for those who are at the top of the pyramid. The most important thing is how to connect things together that are not of the same making. Connect logic, which is abstract, with form. Connect strategy, which is totally without rules, to tactics, which are all about rules, and so and so. This is where it gets, again, complex, and we use the language of design and architecture to explain and do things. And this is our model. Again, I'm not going to go to it in detail. Go to the Archipelago of Design and read about it, but this is our model of thinking. This is our methodology of thinking about reality. In the small z, you can see we start from orientation in a moving world. We try to understand reality as a system. We devise strategy from this understanding. And we divide, the strategy is the logic, and then we devise operations, which is the form. But the organization as a whole is doing many, many, many inquiries at the same time, because there is one in Southern Command, there is one in Central Command, there is one that the Air Force is doing, the one that the Navy is doing, there is one that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is doing, and maybe each ambassador are doing their own thing. So if you look at it from the state perspective, you have a system of systems, you have a system of strategy, you have a system of inquiries, and there is no computer to this day who can do this for us. We also mentioned the disruptions in the headline of this talk. Again, I did a TED Talk on it, 9 minutes of your life. Look at it in the Archipelago of Design website. When I go to it in details, talking about 6 degrees of freedom, or how to think in a disruptive way about what we do, I'll just mention 3 ideas here in short. The first one I already mentioned. For us, the Z model of inquiry, operational design, is just a new tool of navigation in uncharted waters. And since reality keeps changing, If you ever read War and Peace by Tolstoy, he has a saying there that the general is always in the middle of a moving sequence of events. So the general is always in a movie. And it keeps changing. He never starts anything, or she never starts anything from scratch. They're always going to something that is already in motion. So they need to find a way to navigate through all this information. The other one is otherness, or the veil of ignorance. If you ever read John Rawls, when we're generals, we're always looking for the difference in what we see and not similarities. When we are in the warfighting domain, we look for things that are similar or similar enough so that we can take something from our tools, existing tools, and use it. This is like the OODA loop of John Boyd, if you know the concept. Closing the circle as fast as you can based on your experience. So you look for similarities. But when you are generals, and when you are senior officials at the head of the pyramid, your job is to see what is threatening or challenging the system from the outside. So you need to look for, again, with sensors, what is different, what is challenging the system, and when the best way to do it is learn from other people's experience. And this is me on the stage talking to you about Israeli experience so that you can use it as a reference, but then only take from it what is relevant to Colombia. So this is what we call otherness. And this is also from cultural studies. General Puentes, you mentioned multi-dimensional view of the world. So this is part of it. Culture, anthropology, and so on. Or we call it cultural intelligence. And the last one, I guess you recognize it from Star Wars, Darth Vader, or venturing into the dark side. And when I'm saying venture to the dark side, whenever I work with NATO militaries, and this is most of the work that I do, which is the British, the Canadians, the Americans, Scandinavia, they are true believers in transparency. Nothing is escondido, or baja de la tabla. It's all out there. The strategy is published in white papers, and we follow the international rule of law, and we expect everybody else to do the same, and we're always surprised that it's not working. And I need to really extract from them what they don't dare even say or think, okay? Because it's politically sensitive, because it's me too. It's not politically correct. You shouldn't talk about your bosses, even if you know that they're not thinking critically or not understanding stuff. So there are all these shackles you put on your own kinds of thinking that you need to let go of, which we call 6 degrees of freedom. There are ways to do that. So this is also something we encourage with our generals, which we call the tacit knowledge, the intuition. What you talk about when there are conferences, you leave the conference room at break, and then you talk about the really interesting things over coffee, over tinto, right? So we try to bring it to the inquiry, talk about everything that is sensitive. It's very intimate. You have to trust each other. It's all about trust as well. How do you do it? And you also mentioned, General Puentes, you mentioned framing. Again, we take snapshots in time. We kind of stop reality in a very artificial way just to try to understand. And we know that we've stopped it, and we know that we will be lagging behind. But this is our time to create a systemic understanding. And again, there are many good materials about it that you can read. Okay, the last concept, and then I'm going to talk about Colombia and Israel, which is censoring. And we talk about 3 kinds of sensors. I'll start with the tactical sensors, or the war-fighting sensors. The civil war in Syria began in 2011. And in 2011, the regional division that was in charge of the Golan Heights on the Israeli side was traditionally, especially after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, an armored division. And this armored division were supposed to stop divisions and armies of the Syrians and Syrian commandos going to charge from the Golan Heights down the Galilee to the center of Israel. So it was an armored division. But the company commanders who were doing the routine tours on the border, and there is a very simple border, by the way, between Israel and Syria. It used to be from 1974 to 2011, a very quiet border, with some agreements, again, under the table. He started seeing things that he didn't recognize. First of all, he didn't see the military. The Syrian military was gone. So there was no military in the Golan Heights, but there was a lot of military movement by Al-Qaeda, by the beginning of ISIS, by all kinds of, I wouldn't say terrorists, but resistant groups. And they started seeing refugees, and they started seeing people coming to the fence. Now, you don't know when they come to the border if they're Syrians or not Israeli sympathizers, but they came asking for help. So the company commander understood that there is potential here to start talking with these people, to start engaging in intelligence, because they didn't have any understanding of what was going on the other side. And this very simple intuition of the 20 company commanders are about 25 years old. So his intuition, he was brave enough to take it to his brigade commander, to take it to division commander, to bring some intelligence people who spoke Arabic, to start talking to those people on the other side. And when you look at them, they all look the same. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, or just devout Muslims, or Druze, they all look the same. So you need intelligence. You need to start developing intelligence from the ground. And that developed into a full operations that went on for a couple of years. Operation Good Neighbor. You can see the figures. We also treated a couple of thousands of Syrians that we allowed them. We are at war with Syria, yes, but we opened the border and we brought them to Israeli hospitals so they could get treatment from Israeli doctors, and that one went on for a couple of years until basically the situation calmed down. So that's tactical sensors. Operational sensors, again, starting to be more complex. In 2005, we had one of two operations that we've done against the blue side, against our own Israeli civilians, the Jewish settlers in Gaza. Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister, decided that he was going to uproot the 15,000 settlers in the Gaza Strip, what we called Gush Katif, and disengage from Gaza militarily and civil as well. But no one wanted to take the job. Soldiers didn't want to take it because it's civilians. The police didn't want to take it because they didn't know how to do it. They were afraid that the Palestinians were going to use it as well to charge and disrupt this operation as well. And finally, a division commander, Gershon Cohen, again, he was an armored guy, but he had ties with the police, with the military, with the settlers, because his family came from the community of settlers. And he said, I have a way to do it. And this way that was information operations done on the blue side. And he paid a very heavy price personally for that. But he managed to do it in 5 days and without casualties. One of the reasons the police and the other military personnel were afraid to do it, they were afraid that it's going to be a civil war, an inside civil war in the Jewish community. So that's an operational sensor. He was a division commander, and he could do something that even the chiefs didn't know how to do. And the last one that I mentioned is our politicians. Again, I'm talking about the Israeli context, especially in the style of Israeli politics, which is a parliament. It's a parliament democracy, 120 members of parliament. The prime ministers traditionally are very, very strong individuals, and they have ways to bypass the institutions. Benjamin Netanyahu is definitely one. What Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump say to each other we call him Four Eyes, or when this meeting between Putin and the new Prime Minister Naftali Bennett took place a couple of days ago. Would they talk to each other without anyone else, without their staffs, without their advisors, is precious intelligence. Now, if they come back and the military generals don't have a way to extract this information from this politician, they are going to miss the next time they are going to sell something to these politicians, because they will be missing information that they can't get anywhere else. And our politicians are doing information operations on all of us. They're doing deception operations on all of us. They can say one thing to one general, another thing to another general. Politics has no rules. So if you appreciate that kind of censors, and I'll give examples to that afterwards, if you don't know how to do it, find ways to do it. Okay, so moving on to finally to Colombia. I'm going to share with you some pensamientos from insights from our seminar 3 years ago. One of the, to our surprise, I mean, I've never met General Mejia before, and he was just natural for me in talking about operational design. I'm used to Israeli generals talking about why we need it, why we need system thinking, why we need design in the military, but that was such a pleasant surprise. So he started by talking about the institutional necessity, the complex reality of Colombia, the complex rivals of Colombia, the complex political military relations, the complex international stance of Colombia. And you can see why I identified with what he said as an Israeli, because all of these apply to Israel as well. And so that I stay true to what the general said, I'm looking at my notes, and he said that Colombian leaders, they live complexity due to, and again, General Puentes, you mentioned it as well, to over 50 years of experience operating in a complex web of state and non-state actors, from the international to the local domain. And he said everything is closely connected, and the military must understand it as a whole to have a comprehensive vision, because you have trafficking, you have illegal mining, you have extortions and kidnapping, you have money laundering, you have economic warfare against guerrilla, and you have sensitive politicians-military relations. The second thing that he mentioned was the rhythm of reality. When the government demands help from the military on many civilian issues, and the police as well. And the third thing that he mentioned was that the military was dealing with concepts and threats that were not traditional military. Remember what I said about the language of design? So it's threats that are not traditional in military, against your organizational DNA, like a brigade that protects the environment, or a brigade that fights illegal mining. So these were some of the insights that he shared with us in his speech at the conference, which brought us, when I'm saying us, is me, Philippe, and Mathieu Primo, from the Archipelago of Design, who ran the workshop on design. We understood it as a natural intuition of the Colombians. This tacit intuition to appreciate the complexity of reality and to appreciate the necessity to do things that are not planning, to do things that are not battle space awareness. But it was also because of the friction that you had with your changing enemies. And we thought that should be this natural environment to continue developing systemic operational design for the leaders in a context that is not Israeli. But for that we need, and this is also something that General Mejia said in his speech, For that, you don't need tanks, you don't need airplanes, you need education, education, education. But there was also a warning in that seminar that came from the discussions done by the colonels who participated in the workshop, which is if we follow the West, and this is true also for Israel and for Colombia, if we follow the West without thinking critically, then we may be in trouble because the West doesn't understand complexity as we do, doesn't understand the implicit nature of reality as we do, and has maybe a different set of values that is also problematic for us. And this is, I'm not going to go into details because again, I told you, it was an intimate seminar, but I think you can get the overall feel of the drift, of the change that was needed, that the participant talked about. And that was around Colombia, again, trying to become a global partner of NATO. We are a Middle Eastern, Israel is a Middle Eastern partner of NATO, but really NATO prefers that we don't meddle in NATO business because we always bring trouble. I think the Colombian armed forces were doing tremendous, really admirable efforts to join NATO through the effort of writing doctrine and westernizing the military. But as the Israeli, I saw this also as a warning because you were losing your intellectual independence and you have a rich cultural heritage. And I thought that you were offering the world, you weren't offering the world what you have advantage on, and you were going to join the world with stuff that you still had to learn. And by this I mean irregular warfare, negotiations with terrorist groups, living complexity, and so on and so on. And obviously this is all in tension with the need for legitimacy that Israel and Colombia obviously share. So strategy was about trying to find a way to, because you need all of them. You need intellectual independence, but you want to have a joint doctrine with NATO. You need to offer the world something that is unique to you and you have the advantage on, but that is in tension with legitimacy. And you need to do this all at the same time. And this is what strategy needs to do. So we call it taming the tiger. And this is a photo that we took at the last day. I still show this photo because I don't have a photo like this with my IDF generals. Maybe one day I will. Okay, I covered that. So what are the similar stances when I look at Israel and Colombia? What are the similar things that I recognize? And look at how big Colombia is, and look at how, you can't even see Israel on the map. The red circle is 10 times bigger than the actual size of Israel on that map. First of all, and these are all my interpretations, both Israel and Colombia are islands of excellence among failed states. In the case of Israel, Lebanon is on the brink of just falling apart. Iran, Syria, Jordan, these countries are being rescued. The Palestinian Authority, the Gaza Strip, they are not countries that are self-sustaining. I'll be very cautious when I'm talking about your region, but I'm thinking of Venezuela and maybe other countries as well. So these are islands of excellence or villas in the jungle. There is also this expression. And the people around us or the countries around us or the societies around us, they're envy. And envy is a very dangerous thing. And usually the troubles don't remain at bay. They find ways from the jungle or from the failed states to threaten the stability of our own countries. This one I also already mentioned, and take East and West very liberally, okay? It could be East and West from an economic perspective, like communism and capitalism. It could be East and West in the perception of time and space. It could be East and West talking about Russia or the United States. But we are in between. And it's not even a question if we want to choose. I'm not sure we can choose. Definitely Israel cannot really choose to let go of either US or Russia. It has ties to both. It cannot ignore either. It needs to take into consideration their interests. So this is what I call East and West. Special assets, obviously, each of us in our own region. This brings, especially for Israel, this also brings trouble. Many times they refer to Israel as the small devil and the US as the big devil. Last week there was an attack on an American base in Syria by Iranian drones, and they said that the attack on the US base was because an Israeli alleged, according to Open News, alleged attack on Iranian targets in Syria. So they target US bases because of Israeli supposedly actions. We both have heterogenic societies. Daniel, we talked about it in the morning, which causes us to lose face in the world because of the tensions. In Israel, it's the ultra-Orthodox, the Bedouins, the Israeli Palestinians or the Arab Palestinians, and so and so, and you have your fair share of it. But heterogenic societies, on the one hand, remember they help us in thinking critically about ourselves and our identity, but obviously operationally and politically, a lot of trouble. There is no vacuum. Next to the borders, or maybe again, in your case, maybe it's also in the center of the country, there are areas that have very weak governance. And when there is weak governance, and when there is no control, like the frontiers, it knows no vacuum. And if the terrorists are there, if the resistance groups are there are the global resistance groups who keep migrating. So from Afghanistan, now you see Al-Qaeda is back and ISIS are back in Afghanistan. They're going to Africa. ISIS tried to go into Gaza and to the Palestinian Authority. Hezbollah has a very strong presence in Colombia. So it knows no vacuum, which I think is something that Israel and Colombia should have worked on a long time ago, the Hezbollah presence in Colombia and a way to hit them there. And obviously, another point, this constant friction that we have as societies, as politicians, and militaries, demands constant transformation. If other militaries are doing it once in 20 or 30 years, challenging all their assumptions about how they think, how they operate, their technologies, their forms of warfare, for our countries, the pace is a lot faster because our rivals keeps changing. And finally, it's another point that I know they are opening an Office of Innovation in Israel soon, to Colombia. Defense, intelligence, counterterrorism also brings civilian innovation. The cyber Israel is a startup nation. Many people who started these startups in Israel were formerly in intelligence or in special operations or in the Air Force or in the Navy, doing technologies, doing surveillance, doing defense, and took it also to civilian and huge exits over the last 2 years. And what are the similar challenges that we hold? I couldn't resist. I'm sorry, that's the BDS. There is some BDS movement here in Bogotá. I think it's small, but still. Your previous president acknowledged Palestine as an individual state. So even when we have mutual interests, these interests keep changing. And when I'm thinking of challenges, again, for both countries, I'm offering some food for thought. I don't have answers for this, okay? Can the United States be trusted? We are special assets. It's our ally. We take sometimes the heat for the U.S. Sometimes the U.S. takes the heat for us. But can the U.S. be trusted all the time, universally, regardless of what political party is in office? I mean, for Israel, the change from Donald Trump to Joe Biden, and not Biden himself, but the radicalization of the Democratic Party is hindering our relationship. Can NATO be trusted? I mean, look at what is happening to the Ukraine, to Belarus, to the Baltic states. They are being threatened, but NATO is doing nothing. Georgia in 2007 wanted to join NATO, also did tremendous effort to join NATO in 2007. And once the NATO didn't accept Georgia, the Russians invaded. So can NATO be trusted? And when I'm mentioning especially Belarus, I mean, think of this plane, this commercial airline, that was shut down because an opposition leader an opposition activist was on that plane. This was an act of war, and no one has done anything about it. The EU, NATO, or the UN. So can the UN be trusted? Look at the members of the Human Rights Council. Iran, Afghanistan. All these countries who hold very little respect to human rights. But Israel specifically suffers every time for political decisions and stuff that is being raised by these countries who are at war with us, causes us a lot of problems internationally. COVID is an interesting example. This is not necessarily Israel and Colombia, but I think the fact that we are heterogenic societies, as I mentioned, plays a bigger part here. I'm using COVID as an example. On the one hand, we saw that individual states cannot target COVID on their own. It has to be a global effort. But internally, in Israel, for example, until this day, the Arab Israelis or Palestinian Israelis, Palestinian Arabs, whatever they call them, were about 20% of society in Israel. They have no, it's not a respect, they don't trust, they have no trust of the government, so they don't get vaccinated. And they don't uphold the rules and order of COVID. So this is an example for COVID. But if we think of NATO, if we think of the UN, where does the national interest of a country, putting itself first in the engagement with the interest of a coalition or an international organization, which comes first? And in the case of Israel, at least in the last 20 years, again, from a legitimacy perspective, many times we have to favor the coalition interests over our own national interests. So as long as we're at least aware of that, it's okay. But sometimes this gets blurred, and this is very problematic. Because maybe we can one more sentence on how to do this. This is, for me, this is an example of when and how to go to the dark side. If you want to uphold your own national interests, but you know that you are going to suffer from it internationally, from a legitimacy perspective, you need to find a way to do it escondido. And this fifth point is a debate that has been going on for a while now, of small states and medium states. Now, the term itself, I laugh at it because Israel is 9 million people, Colombia is 55 million people. Israel is definitely called a small state, Colombia may be a medium state, and I've heard countries like Canada Sweden, Denmark, Norway, saying that they're small states or medium states, and therefore they never have their own strategy because they will always go second. They are always fighting in coalition, and they will always follow either the empire, or the coalition strategy, which makes totally no sense from a national perspective. So they're not thinking critically, and they're always frustrated. Okay, and the last point goes back to, again, I said soldiers, and I said Israeli, and I said. Again, a common jargon these last 2 years. We stopped talking about wars because it's politically incorrect. We stopped talking about enemies because it's politically incorrect. So we started talking about global power competition. And we also talk about wars with no end. Now, why do I think it's a problem to say global power competition? The US and China are at war. It's an economic war, it's technological war, but it is war. But you cannot call the Chinese, but they are dependent on them, so they can't call them their enemies, they can't call them their rivals. But it's war in other means. So again, it's really questions of how do you position yourself and what you are willing to do, and are you willing to do stuff militarily if it's war? If you call it a global power competition, then maybe you do sanctions and wait for the Iranians to stop developing a nuclear bomb. And we as Israelis have a hard time explaining that we use the jargon of war because many of our conflicts are existential conflicts. Now, Canada doesn't have existential conflicts. Denmark doesn't have existential, I'm talking about countries that I work with. They don't have existential conflicts. But I think Israel and Colombia have existential conflicts. And we have problems delivering that message to the world in trying to explain our posture when we operate in wars, even though there are wars with no end. And when I'm saying no end, yes, it's prolonged conflicts that they have no end. Usually, remember this triad because of issues of legitimacy. So now I'm going to leave you. I'm also looking at my clock. 3 references. Now we're in the storytelling part for a moment, for a couple of minutes. I use 3 examples from the last year from the Israeli experience. Again, food for thought. I'm not saying that you can take it one to one and compare the Israeli and Colombian experience. Operation Guardian of the Walls, May 2021, so it's about half a year ago. Started, again, the question of starting when there is a war with no end is only a question of narrative, because you're always in the middle. But let's say that we take the accepted narrative that it started from what the Arabs said, a threat to the freedom of religion in the Temple Mount, in Al-Aqsa Mosque. So that's where they say it started. They say that the Israelis are not allowing the Muslims to go and pray on the Temple Mount, on Al-Aqsa. And Hamas decided, as defender of the Muslim faith, to launch rockets from Gaza. This link is very weak, but it worked. So first of all, you can see the beautiful dance. I'm joking, obviously. The beautiful dance between the rockets launched from Gaza and the Iron Dome trying to take it down. Okay, so these are the rockets, and this is Iron Dome. This has been going on for over 2 weeks, every night. We were supposed to be in shelters, but it's too nice, so people go out and take photos. And I'm saying here, as you can see, crisis management and strategy making. I once spoke to a former U.S. ambassador, Dan Kurtzer, and I asked him when in the American system and how and who with they devised a strategy. And he looked at me and he laughed. And he said, when we are in office, we don't do strategy. We go from managing one crisis to the other because we don't have time. Again, reality is changing in a faster pace all the time. So we only do strategy when we lose. Then we have 4 years to think and take the time, and then maybe in the first 100 days of grace. So they're doing crisis management. So is that what we're doing as countries? We're just managing one crisis to the other, or do we do strategy? So for me, crisis management is losing the grip of reality. I mean, we didn't understand something and it blew on us, like Operation Guardian of the Walls. And if we manage to do strategy, and again, I'll give an example for it in a minute, I'm calling it doing a reset, starting over, and starting over according to our own terms. Few figures that I think you will appreciate. I don't know how many of you are, it's the other side of the world, and the world has problems that are probably bigger than the Gaza Strip and Israel. But remember I said disengagement in 2005. The Palestinian Authority took over, which is the Fatah movement. Again, there are two big factions in the Palestinians, the Fatah, the PLO, which is Yasser Arafat and Abu Mazen, who is the current prime minister, and Hamas movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is identifying more with Qatar and Turkey. So the Palestinian Authority took over, but they were considered corrupt. And so there were elections, and Hamas said that the elections were fixed, and Hamas took over in 2007 in Gaza, and basically it is a state since then. You can see the conflict from the disengagement. Every 2 to 3 years, we have what we call either a day of battle or a week of battle, or the most we had was in 2014, 5 weeks, again, of rockets and some land maneuver or just aerial strikes and intelligence strikes and special operations and so on. But just look at the numbers. Tunnels, rockets, mortars on their side, and from our side, once we had the Iron Dome, things got a little better. But if we look at Operation Guardian of the Wall, we have uncovered over 150 kilometers of tunnels. Tunnels is the underground metro for internal command and control in Gaza, but it also going under the border and comes out on the Israeli side. It took us 3 years to build an infrastructure that goes 30 meters deep underground so that they cannot make new tunnels. It is operative as we speak. Over 4,000 rockets were launched in 2 weeks. Over 1,200 mortars were launched during this time. Iron Dome had 93% of success, which is nice. So this is just numbers. On the top, you can see again the rocket attacks on Israel from the Gaza Strip over the years. And you can also see what I find interesting on the right side, the map, the colors. So this is basically Israel. The Golan Heights is up there with the Sea of Galilee, and Jordan will be on the right side of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. And the Gaza Strip is this gray matter next to the Mediterranean. So if you live on the border of Gaza, from the Israeli side, let's say 5 to 7 kilometers from the border, you have 15 seconds alarm. You have to find shelter in 15 seconds. Then you have the second belt, which is about 20 to 30 kilometers. You have 20 seconds or 30 seconds. I live in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is about 50 kilometers from Gaza. We had 40 seconds to find shelter. And basically, it covers the entire Israel. It's just a matter of seconds. And from the Hezbollah side, from the north, it's the same, but we haven't had rockets from Hezbollah since 2006. So just imagine it, okay? It's a country, again, a villa in the jungle, an island of excellence, had more unicorns in the startup nation than any other country in the last year. but we still have wars with no end. Again, just for reference, the Gaza Strip it's such a tiny thing. So why is it causing Israel such an international problem of legitimacy? And we're taken into the International Court of Law over Operation Guardian of the Walls as well. This tiny, tiny piece. There are no troubles elsewhere. So if we look here, two ideas again by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, two French philosophers. They talk about the state apparatus fighting the war machine. And this is what we see, again, escondido. So the states don't fight it because they have something to lose. So they use proxies. I guess you know that as well. And the proxies are the war machines. The proxies don't adhere to international rule of law. They don't care about the ICRC. They don't care about the Geneva Convention. So Iran can talk to the world about a new nuclear deal, but it can still send Quds Force and Hezbollah to counter Israel all the time. Again, just for a divertido, the photo in the middle is from CD 2000, the Greco-Roman wrestling finals. You have the legendary Olympic champion Alexander Karelin in red. He is the embodiment of doctrine of Greco-Roman wrestling. And then you have a 17-year-old Roland Gardner, who is a 17-year-old American who looks like an amoeba, doesn't have the fit, doesn't have the style, there's no doctrine, and he takes down this legendary champion of doctrine who retires afterwards and goes home. Just an idea of the type of operations that went on, Guardian of the Walls. So we had means, we had mortars, rockets, MLRS, tunnels, explosive balloons, explosive UAVs, autonomous explosive submarines, PSYOPs, information operations, and cyber operations. Again, another photo, you see the rockets from Gaza on the left, and all these stations of Iron Dome covering Israel to its center. These are videos that we're going to see in the end of the tunnels that we uncovered. These are explosive balloons. They're sending explosive balloons from Gaza. These explosive balloons in the summer are devastating to the farmers. So it's more of a psychological problem than an actual problem. At the end of the day, it's grain. I mean, people don't die from explosive balloons, but it's total frustration from the military. The Gaza division commander said, I did not become a division commander to fight explosive balloons. They tried to send explosive UAVs to the energy infrastructure, our gas infrastructure in the Mediterranean. They tried to send autonomous submarines. They failed. Obviously, at the end of the day, it's Hamas. The most successful thing that they managed to do was the media campaign, the smearing campaign, spy operations, information operations, and basically TikTok operation that surpassed everything else that Israel did, trying to do strategic communication. That was ground up. It was influencers all around the world who identified with the Palestinian cause, bought into Palestinian propaganda, and we lost that war. And because of nothing else, because of that smearing campaign in global media and ignoring the fact that thousands of rockets and mortars were being thrown at Israel, and we had casualties, yes? Maybe not the number of casualties the Palestinians had, but we had casualties. We started having this one front turning into multi-fronts because we have riots in all the mixed cities, the Arab Jewish cities in Israel, riots to extent that we've never seen before. From Lebanon, the Palestinian factions in Lebanon are sending rockets trying to open a front in the north. We have the Iranians sending an attack drone from the Golan Heights here. Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, then is showing the German foreign minister pieces of this Iranian drone that we found. It causes friction with our special ally, the US, wanting answers about what they're hearing about what is happening in Gaza. Gigi Hadid, if you know her, the youngsters here, she has over 50 million followers. She did us great damage. And then we're seeing huge demonstrations, pro-Palestinian demonstrations that become anti-Semitic in all the major capitals in the world. So winning or losing the grip or doing a reset, we definitely lost the war of narratives in Operation Guarding of the Walls. An example from the New York Times showing photos of all the dead Palestinian Gazans, children, but failing to mention all the Israeli children that died during the operation. And another example, this is also a video that I'm going to show you shortly when we finish. Another example is that there was a UN Gaza chief that said, listen, this psychological campaign that the Hamas is doing is false. It's fake news. So he was called in by the bosses to explain. Okay. Second example, which is maybe more uplifting, the Operation Guarding of the Walls, is the Abraham Accords. Now, the Abraham Accords, we were told for 40 years, that if we don't advance politically with the Palestinian Authority towards a two-state solution, we're not going to have peace with any other Arab country or Muslim country in the world. That was the precondition for any type of interaction that we can do in our region, and will remain this isolated villa in the jungle. But circumstances, sensors that we talked about, the attractors were two. One, all the other Arab countries afraid of Iranian dominance and an Iranian nuclear power like Arab Saudi and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and even Iraq, by the way, and the Kurds don't want the Iranians to be weak. So this was all going escondido. That was all going under the table. Then we had the economic potential. Israel is a successful state. It has a lot of technology to send, a lot of information on desertation and water and agriculture with climate change. So there were other incentives, attractors, as I called, to try to develop these agreements. But if it wasn't for Donald Trump, crazy Donald Trump, this unpredicted Donald Trump, who didn't give a peep on what his advisors told him and politically incorrectness, these Abraham Accords would have never happened. This is a photo of after the signing of the agreement on the old cities of Jerusalem, of the flags of the United States and Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. And suddenly, the world opened. The Israelis are going to Dubai like it was always the case. Okay? So now when Netanyahu was replaced by Naftali Bennett and the Likud party went into opposition, people started saying, well, the Abraham Accords are dead. They're worth nothing. And it is stronger than a political party. And the final example that I'm going to give is from, again, how Israel is trying to, again, a new US president. The new US president, unlike Trump and his minister, Pompeo, who relinquished the agreement with the Iranians and put sanctions and talked about 13 points and saw Iran as a threat, not just because of its nuclear aspirations, but also because of its proxies and being a destabilizing catalyst all across the Middle East. Biden thought differently, Biden and Blinken and his presidency, so we need to find other outlets to be able to keep attacking Iran and preventing it from developing more nuclear potential, and we do it through Azerbaijan. Now, Azerbaijan is a Muslim country. It's not democratic. It's further from us, from maybe other countries that we have, but it is willing to, again, a mutual interest in a certain context, in a certain time and space, to join hands against Iran. And what did they get in return? They got a whole herd of drones, attack drones, intelligence drones, and so on and so on, and they used it to end a 27-year-old conflict between them and Armenia. Armenia, who should have been our natural ally, Christians, with Israel having similar history, with the Ottoman Empire and the Turks. But Israel chose moral, temporal relativity and is joining hands with Azerbaijan as rivalries are shifting in order to have an outlet to operate in Iran. Final thoughts. This is from 2018. Pensamientos. Systemic operational design is the guerrilla movement of the mind. And uncertainty is not a threat if the mind is ready to adapt to new things. Gracias. José Muñoz, videos. Ponelo, por favor. Okay, so the first one, I don't think there is voice. The first one just shows you what our intelligence operators see from the thermal imaging. They just come out of nowhere. Okay, this is from 2014. They come out of nowhere on the Israeli side of the border. This is what they recognize. They just come out of a hole. I wouldn't say what kind of just like suricatas. You didn't see. Thanks. It only takes a few seconds. So if you didn't recognize them coming out of that hole, which is, this tunnel was dug, and then it was covered, and this tunnel can wait for years until the right moment, and eventually the tanks and aircraft is being sent there, and they're neutralized. Okay. Second video, Jose. This is an illustration of what it looks like, the tunnels. I've been in one. You cannot breathe. People die there, like digging these. They go for kilometers and kilometers, also to the Egyptian side. The Egyptian side is more about smuggling. To the Israeli side, it's about fighting. And then we developed, since 2014, we developed better instruments, intelligence-wise, and capabilities of targeting from the air and taking down, eliminating these tunnels. And the third one, and last one.
Go!
This is the Iron Dome of rockets, yes. Every night. This is the center of Israel. You can see it from everywhere. Okay, that was for Divertido. We're taking a break. We continue. It's up to you.
Bueno.
Gracias a ustedes por listening. Okay.
Dr. Ofra, thank you very much for your lecture. So we have some questions. We receive other virtual questions, and we have many questions, so we will try to answer most of the questions. The first question is by Mayra Gomez. Mayra Gomez is asking, what's the impact of the recognition Colombia-Palestina in the military I'm sorry, I'm asking them to repeat the question. You didn't have the headsets. So what's the impact of Colombia recognizing Palestine in the military relationships between Israel and Colombia? What's the impact of recognizing Palestine?
To be honest, yeah, I'm not sure if you recognize Hezbollah, we would have been in a great grievance. I know there is Hamas presence in Colombia as well, definitely the BDS movement. Militarily, we will continue to cooperate because our national interests are much stronger. But politically, diplomatically, psychologically, it was a hit. Personally as well, sí, personalmente. Understandable, but a hit.
The next question comes from our virtual attendees. Alejandro Calderon is asking, do you consider that the Cúpula of Hierro defense system will work as a dissuasive weapon, taking into account the hostile scenario here in Colombia? Ironcom, that will work here in Colombia in this hostile scenario?
First of all, I hope for you that your enemies and rivals don't acquire this technology. Mortars are very cheap and easy to make. There are videos in the internet of how to make them. Rockets and precision targeted munition. It depends on a country, again, that will give you this technology. In the Palestinian case, it's the Iranians. Again, Hezbollah, Turkey, maybe. It's harder to develop. So if you had this threat here, yes, why not? But I hope for you that you don't.
Denise Granada is asking, Colombia military service, what do you think that good practice they can transfer after 50 years of armed conflict, but they can export or transfer to other countries?
Well, I said 3 years ago, I had this realization in the operational design seminar that Israel, before it was announced in 1948, was all paramilitary. Our resistance groups against the British mandate, against the Arab legions, was paramilitary. We didn't have a military, not a regular military. And then we became a regular military who was very good at symmetric wars. And as long as we fought countries, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, in symmetric warfare, we were fine. But in the last 20 years, we're fighting proxies again. We're fighting irregular warfare. So this is what we need to uncover again. And I said, I think this is where you are naturals in this kind of conflict. And no one else in the world has this experience like you. You are naturally inclined to it. So I hope you don't lose it, because NATO is like a big corporation. Bureaucracy, standards, and really no existential threat. So I hope you don't lose it. This is one thing. Second is negotiation, as we said. Negotiations with resistant groups, managing to sign a peace agreement, which was very impressive a couple of years ago. And I would say the third one is that I think you have a very special, again, and I'm saying it very cautiously from the outside, externally. You understand national security and the cooperation between military, police, and other security apparatus a lot better than other countries. So this is also something that you can share with the world. Because we don't have, neither country has the luxury, budget-wise, but also because conflicts are not, they don't have these clear borders anymore, that the police is doing one thing, the military is doing another thing, the internal security service is doing some other things. I'll give you an example again from Israel. We have, over the last 3 years, there is a lot of criminal activity in the Arab Muslim communities in Israel, and dozens of them are dead every year. There is a lot of illegal ammunition in these villages and countries and of the people, and every day someone dies, and I'm talking about criminal activities. The police doesn't have the means to handle it in that capacity, and it doesn't have the intelligence to do it. So now there is this huge debate in Israel if they can use the internal security service for that against civilians, if they can use the military for that, if the military can go and find all these illegal weapons and assemble them. I think this is also something that we can learn from Colombia.
The next question by Santiago Olaya. What Israel can help to structure the operational design in Colombia, sharing the category of partner of NATO partner?
I have to be honest, I have a problem with this partnership with NATO, because apart from the official stance that you receive by being a NATO member, NATO is becoming more, I'm going to say a provocative word, becoming impotent, an impotent military. And the fact that they're operating as a whole, like over 50 countries, is not advancing the cause. It is a very weak alliance. Maybe it's the only alliance against Russia, but it's a weak alliance. So there is a good question whether if Israel and Colombia join hands, whether we could, bring the tiger to NATO. Pero no sé.
Within the operational design, what strategy is Israel implementing after the United States left Afghanistan? What are the perspectives of future threats that may be in the region?
So I think one of the only regions that we didn't have, or conflict that we didn't have our hands on, was Afghanistan. And over the last 17 years, I have been working with colleagues in militaries who were doing tours and tours and tours in Afghanistan. That was their existential threat from a warfighting perspective, not from a state perspective. And I think we watched with the entire world, with the entire Western world, we watch in awe and seeing how the Americans just ran from Afghanistan with the tail between their legs and abandoned their partners, abandoned their special assets. And I think this is something that we need to be very cautious of. If I talked before about national interests versus coalition interests, or about this saying that small states don't have strategy, we have to maintain our ability to do things independently. And I imagine that Israel will have to do the same in relation to Iran.
Luis Edilberto Serrato Urrego is asking, what is the strategy of Israel to preserve the maritime borders. Is Colombia's strategy in Colombia is similar to Israel aligning following the United Nations Convention about the Sea Law?
So first of all, I cannot answer about Colombia. I don't know enough about it. I have really good friends in the Israeli Navy, but everybody in Israel is laughing that we don't have a Navy, we just have a coastal guard. And I'll explain in a minute. We have an armada of submarines. Now we have 7 submarines. These are a powerful strategic asset. But the reality of Israel, you need to understand, Israel, you saw the shape of Israel. It's very narrow and long, and it's on the Mediterranean. So basically, the Air Force is covering all Air Force, Iron Dome, by the way. Iron Dome is also covering our assets in the maritime domain, in our waters, yes, in our national waters. The Mediterranean over the last 10 years has become, it's a very small, it's not like an ocean, but everybody's trying to do something in the Mediterranean, and it's all escondido. So I think we're going to see a lot more action in the Mediterranean, and we'll have to develop more assets in that respect. As far as the maritime activities in the Gulf are considered, and this has been going on for a couple of years, but there are attacks, Iranian attacks, and there are some attacks on the Iranians, but I cannot talk about them.
Juan Moreno Hernandez is asking the last question. How will the veil of ignorance of your roles will operate in the international injustice?
If I knew the answer to that, if I knew the answer to that, I would be a rich woman. But this is also, it's, I think at the end, I'm going to talk about Benjamin Netanyahu again. There is a saying about Benjamin Netanyahu that his skin is as thick as an elephant's. Nothing affects him personally. He's been the prime minister in Israel altogether the most years, even more than our pioneer prime minister, David Ben-Gurion. And he took the hit for the entire country. So I think, I'm going to renege on that for a minute and say there is one potential who may lift this veil of ignorance, and that's the refugee problem. I just read this morning that part of what Belarus is doing to the Western countries of the EU is opening the borders and allowing refugees enter the EU through Belarus. And what it is doing to Germany is having the ultra-right going to the border and trying to violently stop that stream of refugees. And that reminds me of the time that there were all the Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorist attacks who caused multiple casualties across Europe. So unfortunately, the veil of ignorance is going to be lifted if European blood is shed. Like we saw with the global war on terror after 9/11.
Doctor, thank you very much for your lecture.
Continuamos con el agradecimiento.
We continue appreciating Dr. Graicer, but the General Major, Dean of the International Affairs Faculty from the Neogranadino Military University. My General, with your permission, Dr. Ofra. Non-commissioned officer from Israel Special Forces, judo player, lecturer, speaker, mother of 2 beautiful children, and me as Dean of this Faculty of Strategy and Security in the Neogranadino University. On behalf of all the university, I appreciate you for your keynote talk. The strategic thoughts is not being born with us. That thinking is built by us. And today you have a very large flag of Colombia. Someone was asking what Israel can do, what can you do with us? But you're already doing it. And you have done it through all this time. And it's to help us to build the strategic thinking. And in order to have the strategic thinking to all this society of the Neogranadino University, is not to be born with it. It's to go through the tactical thinking, the operational thinking, to reach finally to the strategic thinking. And the challenge is not to get there. The challenge is to connect different levels of the strategy with that strategic thinking. As you said in your talk, there are many similarities that we have with Israel, but also a lot of differences. And when you were talking, we were able to understand that those similarities, one way or another, we can take them to this thinking, to be able to interact at different levels, guaranteeing that all this thinking will be built through what you call the materialization of the strategic thinking, and that's the strategy given by the art and the operational design. I had the opportunity to be part of the seminar 3 years ago, Art and Operational Design, where you were saying that art was the individual, some kind of conditions that each one of us has in order to develop an activity, but we needed to land it into an operational design, and that design was just on strategic thinking, landed into a strategy connecting all the levels of the Colombian state, the state as a whole. If we are able one way or another to get out of that tactical and operational thinking that we have, and if we can start to develop what you're proposing today in this talk, a strategic thinking, we're going to be able to connect the academia with the national sensitivity. And my doctor, please see, this is the goal of our dean. Our thinking school, Escuela de Pensamiento, that is going to open soon, talks about both strategy and governance as the core to develop the big strategic thinking that you are proposing. Thank you, Dr. Ofra. Thank you for your talk. Really, I hope that all the community of Neogranada took advantage of it and interiorized it. And now I'm going to give to you this coin. This coin represents the Neogranada Military University and the 3 pillars: science, country, and family. And that represents the union of us with the Colombian society, and from today and many years ago with the Israeli people. Thank you, Doctor.